Welcome back to the Shema podcast, my friends. I have an exciting episode. Let me first begin, before I bring on our esteemed guest, and talk a little bit about what brought me to want to cover this subject. So back in my late 20s, I was, searching for some meaning. I was living life as an atheist. I consulted with a friend, and we were talking about my life, and he turned to me and he said, it seems like everything you describe about your life is about how you're lacking in something and how you can get more of the world around you. And I said, of course, what else is there? And he made a suggestion to me that maybe I should carve out a little time of my life where I'm focused on helping others. Now, it didn't make any logical sense, but it emotionally felt right. And I immediately, over the next week, found two things I began to do. One is I researched and came across an organization I began to volunteer with called Child Advocates, where I was a volunteer guardian ad litem for kids in child protective services. And the other thing I started doing was donating blood. I gave blood at minimum 4 times a year from the age of 29, really all the way up until I moved to this community. I guess just the move just changed all my normal patterns of living. I should probably resume that. But the point I want to make to you is this. During that entire span of my life from age 30 to 40 as an atheist, those activities, it made me feel good. It was pleasurable, although I was always struggling with trying to understand logically why that is so, why I was taking time on my day to help these kids out, and why I was going and donating blood every quarter. It logically didn't make any sense, but I did it because there was something about it that was pleasurable. Now, looking back on my life and knowing what I know now, I can understand that even without a recognition of my Creator, that act of giving to someone else, something that can save their life or benefit their life, that state of giving is what aligned me to some degree with my Creator. And that is why I now understand logically why I found it pleasurable. And as I began to learn and study under Rabbi Yochel Fulby, this whole idea of organ donation came up because I had signed the back of my driver's license, or however you authorized that if something happens to you, take my spare parts, give them to someone else. I don't need them. And he did guide me into a path and said there's a lot of halakhic areas around this to ensure that whether it's permissible or not permissible. But I think the reason I want to cover this is there is an aspect of us, especially with the Jewish people, where we are just naturally inclined to want to help out and save lives and do what we can do. It's what aligns us with our Creator. But there are a lot of halakhic complications around this. So I wanted to bring on Rabbi Grossman, someone that has a long history with Torch, and have him go through and explain, and we can have a conversation and learn the ins and outs of this very complex subject.
Welcome to the Shema podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights intertwined through personal stories as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. For more great Torah learning through Torch, the Torah Outreach Center of Houston, go to torchweb.org. Now to the show. Rabbi Grossman, welcome to the Shema podcast.
Thank you for having me. Wow, I never knew that's too much information for me about yourself. That's beautiful, but amazing idealism there. I hope you retain that idealism in the future.
Thank you, Rabbi. If you could begin to sort of talk about that, you have this history with Torch as well. I
was actually with Rabbi Nagel, I know has been on this podcast, I'm sure.
Yes.
We were the original, there were 4 founders of Torch. In 1998, we moved together to Houston, Texas, to found, for the purpose of founding Torch. I don't know if Rabbi Nagel has spoken about it here. Me and him were buddies and chavrusas back in Queens, New York.
Okay.
And he really wasn't looking to move, but I convinced him. And we came down here with 2 other young couples at the time in 1998. At that point, the goal of the organization, as you know, was outreach. And we started studying, we started teaching at the time. And it just took off. It was amazing. At that time, We were coming both, again, straight out of Kollel, Queens, New York, in a place from a yeshiva called Shara HaTorah. We really didn't know much about Texas, much about anything, except Torah. But what happened was, since Houston is one of the biggest medical centers, so one of the first things after moving down here was we got a lot of requests to teach Jewish medical ethics. And they kept on saying, Rabbi Grossman, can you teach a class on Jewish medical ethics on the Parsha of the week? And I said, I don't see any connection between the two. But after being forced into it, at the time, that sort of piqued my interest, and I started studying more specifically about this topic of Jewish medical ethics, not knowing that how vast the topic is. I mean, I'm still, it's now 24 years later, and still only touching the tip of the iceberg.
Wow. Let me ask you a question. So you're saying you were able to extract medical ethics from each Parsha?
Yes.
Wow.
Believe it or not, I was shocked also. So when I started, I was very pessimistic about the idea, but after they organized a group of doctors together in the medical center. It was 7:30 a.m. every Wednesday morning. And we had a group of around between 10 and 15 doctors on your average Wednesday. And they were fascinated by it. That class, by the way, is my longest running class. It's still the same class. It's still actually going. I
Amazing.
still give it now. It's at 8:30 on Wednesday mornings. Thank God it got a little later. Some of the same core group is still with the class, literally 24 years. And I'm in the midst of writing a book, publishing a book. Actually, the book is written, Medical Ethics on the Parsha of the Week. So
Beautiful.
From that original class, yeah. It's just fascinating. And believe it or not, what I've discovered is I have a list of at least 5 different medical topics on every single parsha, connected to every single parsha.
Wow.
So it's one of the things, and what amazes me is, first of all, I learned a lot of medicine. I don't have a medical degree, but I mean, it's amazing how much, and I'm sure you've spoken about this before, how much is in the Torah relevant to science, and how much you can learn from the Torah, and besides the Torah itself, the Talmud and different interpretations, literally discussing topics which you think is from 2,000 years ago, but how practically relevant they are to common day contemporary issues in medicine and science and many other areas. So that's something that shocked me and amazed me, and it's still every time I discover a topic, and the physicians themselves and the scientists were blown away by this. It turned into at some point in Torch a separate entity. We called it the Jewish Ethics Institute. In 2009, I believe that happened, and then from there it became a national organization. That's when I left Torch and sort of focused just specifically on it's called the Jewish Ethics Institute, which focuses not just on medical ethics, business ethics from a Jewish perspective, from a halachic perspective, and also legal ethics. So we give classes to attorneys, to physicians, we have a medical conference annually, which haven't happened since COVID, but we had one right before COVID, where we do a big conference, a one-day conference, but we're always giving classes. Currently, I give at least 2 or 3 classes a week on Jewish medical ethics.
Okay.
So it's amazing.
So are these classes all in-person classes, or do you do anything online for someone who may not be?
Until COVID, everything was in person, but I do have, everything is recorded, and everything is online at your favorite, wherever you get your podcasts. So you can just either search for Rabbi Yossi Grossman or Jewish Ethics Institute, and it will come up. I have around probably 150, 200 classes online.
Okay.
Since COVID, we do have, one of the classes is on Zoom regularly. So
okay.
If anyone wants to contact me, they can at ygrossman, at j-ethics.org.
Great. Awesome. And so it's medical and business.
Medical and business and legal.
And legal.
Ethics. And we're accredited, by the way. You can get continuing education for physicians, for attorneys, just by attending our classes.
That's amazing. So are the classes in the legal and business matters, are they able to extract something from every parsha as well?
So I have, for the business ethics, I do have something on every parsha. The legal is, I never tried. I'm sure there is, without question, but I just never went there.
It's just the level of wisdom in Torah being so infinite that it just makes sense that if you want to study anything, you could extract something 100%. On that topic.
I mean, it's just amazing to the scientists, especially. They're like shocked and it was easy. It's probably one of my. I thought when I started it sounds crazy, but it was it's one of my best classes, easiest classes for me to prepare, because it's just plugging it in, it's finding a topic in the parsha what it plugs into, and you always find the commentaries there discuss something medical, and almost every parsha.
That is incredible. Okay, so the topic at hand is about organ donation when we're alive, when we pass. Is this something that we can do, not do? What are the considerations we need to take if we want to do something like this? Tell us what we need to know.
As we're going to see, it's a very complex topic, obviously, but we will try to get as much in as possible in the podcast. But, the fact that one of the amazing things about medicine and science, which I really don't have to say, I'm sure everyone realizes that, if you're living in this decade or decades, in the last 50 years, I would say, we're living in just astounding times and inspiring times in the sense of literally miraculous of what science and medicine can do to help people today, which I think for the first thing is we need to be thankful to Hashem for the amazing revelations that have happened, I would say, over the past 50, 60 years in so many areas of medicine and science. But one of the most amazing new technologies, as you're mentioning, is the ability to transplant organs from one human to another. That's, I would say, uneducated guess is probably 40 to 50 years old, maybe a little longer. The first heart transplant, I believe, was in 1967. So what happens is, like all new technologies, and this is something, again, that amazed me and shocked me when I started getting into these topics, continuously amazes me every time I learn something new. And there's always some new technologies coming out. You have uterine transplants, and just amazing what's happening today. And all of it has to be addressed, just like everything in our lives, through a halachic prism. And it has to be, as you mentioned, discussed to see, is it permitted? And if it is permitted, what criteria do we allow it? And then once we do, we say it is allowed and it's permitted, the question then becomes, as you mentioned, is it a mitzvah? Is it obligatory? When we say a mitzvah in this context, I mean, is it obligatory? A mitzvah, there's two ways to translate mitzvah. Mitzvah means nice, good deed, which for sure, assuming it's permitted, is of course a good deed, but many times, as we know, the Torah obligates us to do good deeds. It's not just a nice thing, to put on your checklist, but it's something that might be obligatory. So the question then becomes, if organ transplantation is permitted according to Halacha, according to Jewish law, then does it become obligatory for me to donate my kidney to someone who needs a kidney, or for me to carry a donor card saying that I want to donate, as you said, all my spare parts. Well, after you die, they're all spare, right? All your parts after you die. So one dies. So how does that work? That's obviously the main questions here. So as we said, it's a very complex subject. And the question is not just about donating organs, because it's even about receiving organs. Because if you believe let's say for whatever reason, and we'll get to some of the reasons that you cannot donate organs halachically in certain scenarios, so then the assumption would be you can't receive those organs either. So if, God forbid, someone needs a life-saving kidney or a life-saving whatever it may be, a heart transplant, and they believe that removing someone's heart to transplant is prohibited, so how could you receive that organ? You're really enabling that whoever cut out that heart to sin. So the question becomes, there's a question of donation and being a recipient. Yes. It's a two-way street. And it's hard, and it's one of the things that people struggle with, because if you're of that opinion, as we'll see, in some cases where you can't donate, can I receive one? And as we know, unfortunately, there are, I believe they're saying, and kidney, I'm making up this number, something like 95,000 people on the kidney transplant waiting to get a kidney in the United States. There's a major shortage of organs, not just in the United States, all over the world. But if you live in China, it's a little easier. They go into prison and they just take what they need, right? So, but in the United States, where you can't, there's no black market. I'm sure there is. I don't know. I'm not involved in it, but you can't just go and buy an organ on eBay. Right. That's illegal in the United States, and I wouldn't suggest that. But the question then becomes, how, am I even allowed to receive an organ if I'm of the opinion, halachic opinion, that I can't donate one? So it's a complicated issue in that sense.
Okay. I don't know if you're going to address this, but I have been reading a lot that they are learning how to sort of grow organs for transplant, but they're doing it with pig tissue.
Yes.
So
that's actually my grandmother, I would say probably 40 years ago, got a heart valve transplanted, which is from a pig. And I believe there's, what's that medical TV show, the old one? I don't remember the name.
I'm just thinking of Doogie Howser.
So whatever the name was, so they once had an episode, where they had an Orthodox Jewish girl in the episode, again, it's fiction, stating who needed a heart valve transplant, and it was from a pig, and she refused to accept it because she was Orthodox. So that's one of the things which I want to talk about today, one of the complex issues. There's so many myths involved in what the Jewish view is, and that have to be dispelled, and that's something we'll try to address. But there's no question whatsoever you can accept any organs from pigs, from camels, whatever animal you like, that's not even a question.
Okay.
It's not even, we don't even have to address that. Halacha only prohibits ingesting non-kosher animals. If you're not going to ingest it, if it's going to be, as a matter of fact, you can even shoot yourself up with pig, if you want, technically into your veins. There's no prohibition. It's only ingesting and eating non-kosher species.
Okay.
So that's just to get that off the table. But there's so many myths, and including, as you see, of course, the Jewish Hollywood writers of the show who had no idea. Most Jews, and let's be honest, know nothing, and they only hear the myths. Of course, you have to be buried with all your organs, etc., as we're going to discuss. So that's something, yes, that has to be, many of the myths have to be dispelled, and hopefully by the end of this podcast they will. At least we'll try.
Great. Let's start with probably the easier topic, which is donating organs when you're alive, like kidneys, because I know that's huge in the Jewish community.
Yes. So the huge in what way? Huge.
There's the number of people I hear of Jews that are more than happy to donate a kidney to a fellow Jew.
It's an amazing thing. It's a recent phenomenon, I would say, in the past 10 years probably, but there's an organization, and it's worth going to their website. I cry when I see their videos, literally. It's just amazing to see. I'm starting to cry just talking now. There's an organization called Renewal.org, Renewal, and basically it was an organization founded by, I think, Hasidic people, who their whole goal is to help facilitate kidney transplants for people, Jewish people, not only in the Orthodox community, and any community, and they'll help non-Jews too. It was started by Hasidic Jews with, obviously, to help the community, but they don't discriminate. But the way it works is basically they educate, they go into shuls, and they do drives, and they have people register, be swabbed, or if they're looking for a specific individual or general, they have their own list, people who come to them. And the way it works is, of course, as we mentioned, there's a huge waiting list. The average wait time, I think, is between 6 or 7 years to get a kidney in the United States. So what they do is if someone specifically needs a kidney, they have a right to, of course, look within their family and their friends and do a drive for themselves, and then that kidney will be targeted to that specific person. So this way you bypass the waiting list. It's one way to bypass the 60, as we said, 90,000 strong waiting list, which can take many years, and people die on that waiting list. So what this organization does is they usually also obviously the closer DNA of the people involved, the better chance of a match. Besides obviously the basics, which is blood match, and you have to be blood matched, etc. There's also the closer the DNAs, and that's why family members have much better chance of a successful donation, because little I know, again, I'm not a medical expert. Don't take this as medical guidance. This is a disclaimer. Please don't sue this podcast. The chances, as we know, one of the things is graft versus host disease. The body rejects, even if it's a match, the body can reject the organ. As long as the closer the DNA is, the less chance of rejection by the body. So therefore, within the Jewish community, where let's say it's an Ashkenazi person and they're looking in the Ashkenazi community, or in a Hasidic community where everyone is, in this particular Hasidic community, might be of Hungarian descent, and they do a drive for this person of matches, the chance of coming up with a match, since you're both from the same area, you're both Jewish, you're both Hungarian descent, let's say, or if it's Sephardic, you're both from Morocco, whatever it is, the chances are much higher to find someone who matches. And that's what they do. And they have a database of literally by now hundreds of thousands of people. I'm in that database. Anyone can go be in that database. They're an amazing organization. They don't need to be plugged, but you should check them out. And live donation, there's no question. Everyone agrees. It's 100% permitted, halachically speaking. As we're going to see, it doesn't have the potential obstacles of donation after death that we're going to discuss in a few minutes. But it's 100% permitted. That's not the question. The question is only, again, does it become obligatory? Because once it's permitted halachic now, is it a mitzvah? If I can save a fellow's life, so we're going to talk about that a little more later, but if I can save someone's life, That's a biblical obligation. So meaning if you're driving down Braeswood, I don't know if the national audience will going across the George Washington Bridge and you see someone, drowning in the Hudson River, and you're a good swimmer, technically speaking, you are obligated, biblically speaking. There's a verse in the Torah that says, "Lo ta'amod al dam recha," do not stand idly by while your brother's blood is being shed. There's another mitzvah in the Torah, another one in the 613, which is hashivosalo. You're obligated. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Talmud in Sanhedrin says you're obligated to return someone's health to them if you can. So that means even if you're not a doctor, you can save someone from drowning. You know how to swim. You have to jump in and save them. Those are biblical obligations, without question. So the question now becomes, why don't we all have to go and be swabbed and help and donate our kidneys? Because you can live with one kidney, right? As long as you're a healthy person and you have no kidney disease. Most people don't get kidney disease. It's very rare, again. So you should have technically this obligation. So, and this is discussed in various responses by contemporary authorities. This question was posed to Rabbi Yosef, to Moshe Feinstein, to many halachic authorities over the years. And the conclusion more or less is, although that might change in the future, is yes, it's a mitzvah in the sense of it's a laudable act and it's a beautiful thing, but it's not obligatory. And the reason being is because you don't have to risk your own life to save someone else's life. And since a kidney donor surgery there are risks involved, they're minimal risks, true, not minimal statistically, I mean. If something goes wrong in the surgery, obviously, a person can bleed to death. There are many things that can go wrong in the surgery. It's a serious surgery, and you're going to be put through a lot of pain. That's a separate issue of how much pain do you have to go through to perform a mitzvah, and how much do I have to give away? Do I have to give away an organ to fulfill this mitzvah of saving someone's life? So because of the risk involved, almost all authorities, like say almost all, and I believe it might be all, but I don't want to rule anyone out, agree that it's permitted. It's a laudable deed. It's something that's, if you're able to do it, it's beautiful. But you're not obligated because of the risk involved. I just want to dwell on that for 1 second, meaning it's a fascinating thing in Judaism, which people are not aware of. Where, as we know, Judaism is a great religion. But one of the beauties is, yes, you're obligated. By the way, in Western law, you're not obligated to save anyone's life. If someone's drowning or you see someone jump off the bridge and you're late for your meeting at work, in American law, you can wave to them and say, sorry, I'm late for my meeting. And you did nothing wrong. I mean, obviously you're an idiot, maybe.
Right.
But meaning legally, there's nothing wrong. In Jewish law, as we're saying, there's an obligation. It means if you wave to the guy who's jumping off the bridge, you didn't stop and try to help him, or even if you know how to swim, like you're saying, and jump in and try to save him, assuming you're a good swimmer and it's steady water, then you're not only, you did something wrong, you violated a biblical commandment, a negative commandment, and maybe even a positive commandment, maybe both. Okay, so it's a serious offense in Jewish law. It's very different than secular law. But on the other hand, if you risk your life to save someone, that means, let's say someone's being mugged, okay, with someone's being held up at gunpoint, and you do not have a gun, and you're not, or someone like me might have a gun, but you're not a good shot,
right?
And you go ahead and try to save that person, where you're literally putting your life in danger. So not only says Halacha, this is a responsive from the Radvaz in the 1100s, 1200s. Not only is it not obligatory, you're not a hero. Not only, and you're not a hero. In Western law, if you take the bullet for the president, you're a hero, right? Take the bullet for someone else.
Right.
In Jewish law, it says you're a pious fool, meaning you listen. It's very nice. You're trying to be pious and beautiful and saving someone else's life, but at the expense, you're being altruistic at the expense of your life and your family, right? If God forbid something happens to you, your wife's not going to be in a happy state. Depends if you have life insurance or not. Your kids are not going to be in a good situation. So risking your life to save someone else's life is viewed as foolish.
Because our body itself is not even ours to make choices on. Right.
That's the major thing that we're going to talk about. Okay. Relevant to organ donation also. So that's a very good point you bring up. But again, as far as living donation, it's laudable, it's beautiful, because the risk, it's sort of an in-between stage. The risk is not sufficient to say you're a fool by doing it, because, again, you can live a beautiful life with one kidney. 90, I think the numbers, and again, this is an estimated guesstimate, somewhat educated, but I don't know for sure. I don't want to say the exact numbers, but somewhere of 98% of people come through even major surgeries if you're healthy. Okay, so, it's a 2% risk. It's a small enough risk that it doesn't prohibit you from donating your kidney, But because of that risk and the pain involved, also you have to take off from work, the pain involved does not obligate you to donate your kidney. But if you want to do it, and I've looked into this, I've had that urge. My wife talked me out of it, and some other doctors. But I mean, the people. If you speak to people who've done it, I mean, they changed their life.
Yes.
I met a husband and wife who done it. I mean, like you said, if you go to this website, you watch the videos. I mean, I cried, and it's something I wish I aspire to do one day. Hopefully, I'll get there. You only have till 60, I think, till 70, where they'll take your kidney. So I got time, thank God, to make my decision. But I would recommend it highly for someone who, again, you have to have a psychological evaluation. They want to know why you're doing it. Obviously, it has to be for the right, reasons. But anyone who spoke to, and I've met many people who've done it, it literally changed their life. And
yes.
You meet the person. I mean, in these cases with renewal, first of all, they have a dinner every year. And all the donors are invited and all the recipients are invited. It's amazing. They go for a weekend. And the people meet each other. I mean, you're literally part of this person. I mean, you save this person's life. I mean, you can imagine the emotions that go through there. It's just amazing. Husbands and wives have done it together, not just to each other. That's a beautiful love story, but to strangers. And they meet, and they get together with the couples they've saved. And it's an amazing thing. I recommend it highly. Again, not talking from experience, just from people I've spoken to. And it's 100% permitted halachically as long as you're healthy and obviously you don't have kidney disease, or you don't want to give away your kidney in that situation, and that's not good for the person who's getting it either. It's just amazing, and you can save someone's life in the literal sense. So that's really not a halachic question. Again, the only question would be, is it obligatory, is it not? And that seems to be, almost everyone says it's not, although as time progresses, and the surgery might become less risk involved, so then the halacha might change in the sense of, people think halacha can't change. This is important to note also. Halacha can't change, that's true. Halacha is eternal. As we know, Jewish law is always eternal. But if the science changes, then the halacha is only as good as the science. So when we as a rabbi, let's say, are ruling on a medical ethics case, a medical issue in halacha, such as this, so we work with the numbers given to us by science. So if the numbers change, so let's say defining risk in this case is really what the issue. What is the halachic definition of risk? Because as we know today, everything is considered risk. Driving on 610 is probably a lot more risky than the surgery, than donating your kidney.
Exactly.
Okay, so but how is risk defined? Bungee jumping, can I go downhill skiing on the black diamond course? It's where do you draw the line? And it's a gray area. Halacha doesn't clearly define that. It's one of the gray areas in halacha. What's considered risk, and there's a lot of factors involved. So if the surgery becomes better, or you're saying, let's say, they can do it in a way where there's literally minimal risk to the donor, so then things, of course, will change. There are other issues. Moshe Feinstein, I think, is of the opinion you're not obligated to give up an organ in either case, even without the risk factor. I believe he says this in a response, and because, like any mitzvah, I don't have to give away more than a fifth of my net worth to perform a mitzvah. I don't know if you're aware of that principle.
Okay,
so that's a principle for a positive commandment. I do not have to give away more than a fifth of my net worth. Let's say I can't afford tefillin. Buying a pair of tefillin would cost more than a fifth of my net worth. I don't have to buy a tefillin. So he says giving away an organ is sort of in that same category.
Okay.
Where I'm not obligated to do that. Again, it's a mitzvah. I can spend more on tefillin if I'd like. Same thing, I could give away an organ, but I'm not obligated for that reason. So we're not going to go there.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So as I mentioned, I used to give blood all the time. So I got out of the habit when I moved here. I did it for about 20 years. That's probably zero risk. Is there an obligation?
Interesting, yes. So again, if you're giving it if there's a need for it, which as we know, many times there's shortages and there's no question, you could do it. It's actually healthy. They say it's good for you. Not only it's not a risk, it's good for you, besides the donuts they give you afterwards. Otherwise, it's good for you. So yeah, I would say in a certain sense, if you're doing it to help someone, especially, by the way, when you can earmark it. Obviously, that blood is not earmarked, but they put it in the bank, even if you're not the same type, but they then can give to someone. So let's say I've had cases here in Houston where someone needed blood, a certain type of blood, but they said if you come down to donate, they'll
credit the person.
Credit, right, exactly. Yeah. So then 100%, I would say it's obligatory.
Okay.
If you can do it easily. As far as if you earmarking it for a donor, I would say it's 100% obligatory. to do it.
Okay.
In that case,
If you know the person,
if you're giving it to someone, I mean, if someone needs it, and we'll talk about that a little more. Coming up. So.
Okay. Great.
So that's as far as live donor is concerned. Again, highly recommended. Easy for me to say, and I've never done it, but hopefully one day I'll reach that level where I can get the courage to do it. It's an amazing. I did swab recently for someone in the community who they were doing a drive for, and I called the guy, and I'm friendly with him. I was joking with him. His son ended up donating a kidney. It was a match. But I told the guy, someone who used to live here, and I told him, listen, I'm not saying I'm going to get swabbed. I'm not saying I'm going to do it for you, but I'm going to get swabbed, and then we'll negotiate afterwards. So, so that's as far as live donation. So you ready to move on to?
Yeah, let's go.
So there's basically, as we're going to see, there's 3 obstacles that need to be overcome, which I'll put out there right away. Okay, so there are 3 potential obstacles. The first one is what we call the prohibition of being nene, that means deriving benefit from a dead body. Okay, that's a prohibition. As we're going to see, it's questionable if it's biblical or rabbinical, but that's issue number 1. I mean, there's no greater benefit, you can argue, than getting an organ from a deceased body. You're deriving benefit from a body, and that's prohibited again in Jewish law to derive benefit from a human body.
Okay.
So that's question number 1. Issue number 1, which we'll address. A similar issue, there's a prohibition called nivul hamet, which means literally mutilation of a body or desecrating a body. So the Torah talks about, it's interesting, and it's in the context of a victim who was executed for a capital crime in Jewish law. As we know, Jewish law, the Torah does talk about capital punishment. And the Torah says there explicitly, you shall not defile the body. So even someone like that, and we're talking about someone who did a terrible thing, who violated a capital crime, even their body, it says, shouldn't be defiled, shouldn't be mutilated in any which way. So for sure, we understand the Talmud extrapolates from that someone who is a tzaddik, who didn't do anything wrong, right? Who didn't do this terrible capital crime. Surely his body cannot be mutilated. So it says, actually interesting, the Rashi says the reason there, describes it in the Torah, the reason being, this is in Parshat Kiseitze, in Deuteronomy, Rashi says, is because the Torah actually says, Ki nivlas elokim talo, the desecration of God is hanging. It's talking about, he wasn't hung, his body was hanging, and it says it's a desecration of God to leave the body hanging. Rashi explains the reason is because we're all created in the image of God. And if a body which was created in the image of God is now hanging, that's sort of a desecration of God's name. It's people look and say, it's like God's hanging almost. It's like your twin brother.
Right.
So it doesn't mean, I always say, it doesn't mean I hope God doesn't look like me. That would be bad. But in that sense, since we're all created in the image of God, in that sense, and that's why it could be, it applies in Jewish bodies, non-Jewish bodies, there's no distinction, if that's the philosophy behind it. So
okay.
That's an important aspect. So that's another issue. So when you're going to do surgery, removing an organ post-mortem, the assumption is there's going to be what's called nivul hamet, desecration of the body. Although It's not so simple, depending on the organ, obviously, and etc. But that's issue number 2. And issue number 3, of course, is the biblical obligation. This is what everyone knows about. The assumption is a biblical obligation to bury a body. A Jewish body has to be buried. A non-Jewish body is questionable. If this is only one of the 613 for Jews, as many of them are. Most of them, as we know, are just for Jews. So according to many, this obligation is just for Jews, that you have to bury a body. That the assumption is everything included in that body. As we know, there are organizations in Israel, God forbid, after a terrorist attack, where they go and pick up little bitty pieces, that got blown up for this reason, because there's an obligation of burial. So They go and they climb the walls, they scrape, and it's pretty morbid, but that's part of what they do, is they have to make sure to get all the limbs and bits and pieces to make sure everything is included in the burial.
Okay.
And that's that organization, famous organization known as Zaka. And that's all they do, because it's such an important mitzvah, the burial of a Jewish body. And as we know, Israel changes prisoners, live hundreds of terrorists for one Israeli soldier. The corpse of one Israeli soldier had been done, arguably whether that's a good thing or bad thing. But the reason is because we treat a body with such reverence and holiness, a Jewish body, because what it was, even though it's no longer alive, but it was a vessel that held the soul, that held the neshama, and it's holy even after death. That's why that's the assumption of this prohibition, and therefore we can't mutilate it. We can't derive benefit from it, just like any holy object. We can't, and it needs to be buried. As the Torah says, in that, by the way, in the same context there, it's talking about the executed person who was killed for a capital crime and a capital punishment. That's where it says also that he must be buried that very same day, the Torah says. Now, we do push off the burial for the sake of the honor of the dead. Let's say there's relatives have to fly in to Israel or to America from out of town, so we'll push off the funeral, as we know. But so some might make the argument here, in the case of organ donation, maybe that's an honor for the dead to have his organs. But I didn't see anyone who really agrees with that argument. Haven't found anyone who agrees with that argument. So those are the three basic obstacles that have to be overcome to allow organ donation after death.
Okay, very good. Right, so now we'll go through each one of these, because it seems like number one, how do you even get around that one to not derive benefit from
Right, so before we're going to go to there in a second, but before that, I want to start very clearly, and this is a key point, which has to be very clear, that this, now, I'm just going to address it head on, which is, there's a concept in Halacha called pikuach nefesh, which I don't know if you're familiar with that term, which means saving of a life. Okay, saving of a life, as we know, in Jewish law, overrides basically all of the 613 commandments, not completely all 610 commandments. There are only three exceptions to that, which we're not going to get into now, but I'll mention them, which is the only exceptions that are not, meaning life is of utmost importance in Jewish law. So that means, as we know, you can eat on Yom Kippur if the doctor says you have to, because, right, even though it's the holiest day of the year, life overrides. Saving a life overrides that. If you eat on Yom Kippur, you can eat chametz on Pesach, right? All this is allowed in order to save lives. So the only three exceptions, by the way, are what's known, I call them the big three, which is idolatry. That means, someone puts a gun to your head and says, bow to baby Jesus or I'll shoot you. So in that case, you would not be allowed to bow to baby Jesus, even if that's not your intention. Even if you're faking it, still doesn't make a difference. That's prohibited, and you have to give up your life, sacrifice your life for that. The other one is adultery and other forms of sexual immorality. Okay, halachic adultery.
Right. My wife had that mitzvah imposed on me back before we were religious too.
Right. She put a gun to your head.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So that of course is another one, is number two, and the third one, idolatry, adultery, and murder. Okay, and as we'll see, this comes in over here. That means someone puts a gun to your head and says, "Kill this person, or I'll kill you." You have to let yourself be killed before permitting murder. Okay.
Okay.
Those are the only exceptions to the rule. Everything else, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, violate Shabbat, eat pork, eat a double cheese, bacon cheese, and with a mac on Yom Kippur with the lettuce, which has many bugs in it, you're obligated to. As a matter of fact, it becomes a mitzvah to do that on Yom Kippur. So it means if someone walks to shul and puts a gun to your head and says, eat this double bacon and cheese on Yom Kippur and drive to get it at Whataburger, it becomes a mitzvah to do that. Because the Torah says, v'chai b'hem, you shall live by all the commandments. And it's the assumption, and the Talmud interprets that to mean that if any commandment of the Torah is in any which way threatening your life, then it's not a commandment. A mitzvah is to live by the commandment.
So are you obligated so if someone puts a gun to your head and says, I want you to eat this treif,
you have to eat it.
You have to eat it.
Yeah, you can't try karate, risk your life, like we said before. Maybe, I'll knock the gun out of his hand not to eat the burger. No, you have to 100% agree to eat it. It's a mitzvah now to eat that burger. That burger could be even you make a bracha when you eat the burger, because it's now, it's obligatory to eat it, because the Torah says you shall live by the mitzvah. That means in this case where if you try to observe the mitzvah, your life will be threatened. You can't do that. Then you're in violation of this law, v'chai b'hem, you shall live by the mitzvah. So that being said, so now if we're saying, yeah, very nice, there are three biblical, maybe rabbinical obligations, which is burial of a dead body, and now we're talking about, again, it's talking about body that someone needs the heart to live. A recipient, right? The recipient is waiting for this heart, or you have, right, whatever the case, they're waiting for this kidney, and his body's now dead. It's a no-brainer, halachically speaking. If it's something that can save someone's life, all these three issues that we mentioned, which is, again, the body has to be buried. It's a very nice mitzvah in the Torah. Do not mutilate the body. Don't derive benefit from the body. All those are very important mitzvahs, but if you can save someone's life by overriding that mitzvah, it becomes 100% irrelevant. The question is moot. You have to do that, of course. It's not as simple as I make it, but let's for argument's sake at this point. So meaning when we're dealing with a organ, and this is an important myth because, as we're saying, people think, oh, Judaism, you can't, body has to be buried. It's very funny that I've seen videos of secular Israelis where this organization that deals with, and I'll mention them briefly, called HODS, Halachic Organ Donation Society, and they promote Jewish organ donation. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about that a little more, but they have made videos where I've seen the founder going around and interviewing, to cafes in Israel and saying, would you donate your organ, to secular Israel, totally secular, as they're eating in cafes, they're probably eating, ham sandwiches. But
right.
God forbid, I would never do that. Don't you know Judaism says you have to bury them dead? Of course, the body has to be there, buried. So these are people who know very little about Judaism, but the first assumption, and I think most Jews who are uneducated in Torah, and even those who are, some of them, unfortunately, will say, what do you mean? There's an obligation to bury the dead. How could you donate their organ? It's against halacha. So this is one of the first myths that need to be dispelled. There's nothing that is against halacha, even though the Torah says, yes, they're correct. The body has to be buried, and as quick as possible, and we don't mutilate the body, etc., etc. We don't derive benefit. But when it comes to saving a life, life overrides everything. It's not one of the big three. And therefore, it's overridden. Okay, so that's
Gotcha.
Getting it out of the way. So the only question now becomes really, there's two questions that we'll have to address. And that's why I'm saying it's not so simple, and this is the complex part. There's an issue, which is the issue of what's the definition of death, halachically. Because, as we know, and we'll get into that a little more, but there's a big argument in the scientific, or there was at least, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, which is at which point, medically, is a person considered dead? Okay, which is it cessation of breathing, or is it cardiac cessation of the heart? Okay, at which point does science define death? So that's very nice. Science could define death. I always say this is really not a scientific question. It's a theological question. Because what's death? At least in Judaism we believe, and I can't speak for other religions, I assume it's pretty similar. Death is when the soul leaves the body, right? So that's not a medical question. Not something that could be defined by science.
You can't measure that.
Right. I mean, maybe halachically you can measure it, or maybe if you're a Kabbalist, you can see the soul ascending from the body, but I don't get paid enough, so I'm not
We're not on that pay grade.
I'm not a Kabbalist, I'm not on that pay, that's past my pay grade. But science can't define when you're dead, really. They can say when the insurance company stops paying, or they can say when they want to kick you out of the bed because they need it, because they want to make more money for the next patient coming in, and they consider, and the insurance will continue paying. But they can't, the criteria of death is really a theological question, which has to be defined by each individual religion, and I'm assuming it is. I can only speak for Judaism. So therefore, it's very nice that, let's say in today's medical terms, in the most of the Western world, defines death by cessation of brain function. And by the way, this was an interesting thing because it wasn't relevant until they invented the ventilator, meaning this question was a moot question in the sense because it used to be when someone's brain stopped functioning, so within the next 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes maximum, they would stop, their heart would stop. Because since once your brain stops functioning, so you have cessation of brain function, and there's nothing sending a message to brains. Once they invented a ventilator, so what the ventilator did was it sort of artificially breathes for you and continues pumping oxygen to the heart without the brain sending the message to do that, for your body to do that on its own. So once the ventilator was invented, and I can't tell you what year, let's say somewhere in the 50s, 60s, so that's when now there was all of a sudden, now what do? The person's brain stopped functioning, so technically they would die anytime before the invention of this new machine, this new technology. But now that we have the ventilator, so now you have 2 points of death, because the brain stops functioning. We hook the guy up to a ventilator. He can live for another 2 years now on his ventilator, and his heart continues to pump, even though there's total cessation of brain function. So now science had to decide, is the guy dead? Is he not dead? In that 2 year period, does his wife start collecting life insurance, or not? Okay, so it became very complicated, and science, I don't know at which point they did make a decision. I'll discuss that a little, but it now became a halachic question, because much more importantly, because irrelevant to what science says, what is the halachic criteria for death? Okay, now how is this relevant all to the topic of organ donation? It's very relevant, because this is the key issue, and this is why it's so complex and also very much in controversy, and there's so many myths about it. It's because of this issue, because, of course, as everything, the beauty of Judaism, we have two opinions as to what's going to be considered halachic death. Some opinions say cessation of brain function, as we'll talk about, and some say cessation of cardiac function. So once we have two opinions, now the reason why it's so important to organ donation is because, I just want to make sure I'm getting this right, is because obviously as we know, the fresher the organ is, so to speak, you have a very small window once you harvest an organ after death. Okay, so in the old days, if someone died, until you had to ascertain their death, their heart stopped pumping and everything, and then you did tests to make sure that you can't revive them and resuscitate them. So you were left with this organ, and then you have to first start the surgery then. And some of them, obviously, with a heart, for example, heart transplant is very complicated surgery. And by the time you flew it to, wherever this other person is who needs the heart, or they flew to you, it can take, this was, let's say, like we said, the first heart transplant, it's 1967. So when they were, for example, experimenting with heart transplants, they were literally killing people. I've spoken to people who've it's happened in South Africa, the first heart transplant. People who were involved admitted they killed patients. Patients were still alive. They removed their heart to
They
experiment.
had cardiac and they had brain functioning.
No. It's questionable. I don't know. Yeah, some of them didn't. Some of them, they literally killed patients as part of the, they were in a coma and they said there was irreversible coma, which would be questionable. They didn't have the same machinery and technology to ascertain cessation of brain function at the time as they do today, or at least they weren't using it. So, and I've seen interviews with people who actually met the nurses involved in the surgery. The original doctor, I don't think it's no longer alive, but they have a museum in South Africa where you can actually go, and they admit that they did experiment and killed patients, and it might have been with consent in some cases, but as you mentioned before, it doesn't make a difference if murder is murder. Okay?
Right.
And therefore, initially, Moshe Feinstein has many responses very against heart transplant surgery at the time. He's saying you're killing two people. First of all, because you're removing the heart of the person who has obviously the donor, and if he's technically still alive, that's murder. So you're removing his heart, and he's not getting another heart. And the guy, you're removing his deficient heart, but he's still alive. And now you're going to put the heart in the beginning. He lived for maybe 3 months, 2 months, at the beginning when the technology was just being worked on. So he says you're killing two people with that surgery. You're killing the donor and the recipient, because the recipient, we don't know how long. He might have lived for another 10 years with his deficient heart. Now you're putting in this other heart, which the chances of being rejected at the time were probably over 50%. So that's also murder. So it was very controversial. And so now the problem becomes, once you have two ways to ascertain death, and we're not sure which one is correct, whether it be medically, or more importantly, halachically, so the issue now becomes, if you take out whether it's the heart, whatever you're taking out, it's an important organ, causes the person now to die, the donor, so you could be killing him. If you take it out too early, where he's not halachically dead, which is, in most cases, they want to do that because, again, if his heart is still, the blood is still pumping, that's the ideal time to take it out, because then it's still a fresh organ and it had the blood pumping minutes ago. Once the person died, the window shrinks. Once the person has total cessation of heart function, the window is a much smaller window.
So let me clarify something. So according to Halacha, you said there's two opinions. One is brain death, and one is sensation of, you said breathing?
Heart. Brain death technically is cessation of breathing, because once your brain stops functioning, then the brain is what controls your breathing mechanisms. Okay,
gotcha.
So the one is total cessation of brain function, which is cessation of breathing, really. That's really the real criteria, as we'll see, and halachically speaking. And then the other one is cessation of heart function. So that's why this is so important, because, again, if you, just to summarize, if you say that it's cessation of heart function, then if you take the organ out prior to cessation of heart function, cessation of heart function always happens after cessation of breathing. So the heart will continue to function even after someone's brain dies, as long as they're on a ventilator. They'll always continue to function, but for a very short time. But if they're on a ventilator, they can stay alive for a lot longer. So it's a lot, quote unquote, a lot.
Right. What about there's certain functions of the brain, one that handles the things like breathing and those natural things, but then we have our more frontal lobe, cognitive functioning. What happens if that area of the brain dies? I don't know if that's possible, but the part of the functioning of the brain that just regulates breathing is still functioning, but the person's, like in a coma, I guess.
It's a great question. I want to admit that I know very little about function of the brain in any which way, but I just know, again, from the halachic perspective, believe it or not, and this is something which, when I first saw this, was blew my mind also. The Talmud discusses in Masechet Yuma, I think it's 87 or 83, I don't remember, a tractate Yoma discusses this question of what's considered dead, halachically. The reason why it's relevant then, it was before ventilators, discusses the case of a building collapse on Shabbat, where, as we know, you're allowed to save someone's life. Of course, as we mentioned, you can violate Shabbat to save someone's life, without question. The question becomes now, once it becomes a search and rescue effort, you know the person under the rubble is now dead, you can no longer violate Shabbat, just to get a body out. That's a very nice thing. As we're saying, it's important to bury someone, but you wait till after Shabbat. You don't violate Shabbat to bury someone. We don't do funerals on Shabbos, right? So the Talmud discusses what happens if I'm going through the rubble and I get to the point where I uncover his head and I see he's no longer breathing. So the question is, can I continue removing the rubble on Shabbat? Assumption is you violated Shabbat. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. So says the Talmud, no, once you ascertain that he's no longer breathing, put a feather on his nose in those days, so now then you have to stop removing the rubble, as long as you know no one else is in the rubble, of course. So that's over there Rashi mentions the heart, that you check for a pulse and his heart is no longer beating. So that's the controversy derives from that Gemara, seemingly, as to what is the end of the criteria to halachically that ends someone's life. Is it heart function or cessation? And we're not going to get into that whole topic because it's very complicated, obviously. But the point being is, and again, it's not that today the criteria halacha doesn't change. So whatever the Talmud there says is the criteria of death, that is going to be the criteria of death today. Okay. Irrelevant of new technology. All the new technology just allows us, first of all, to resuscitate people. Let's say today, 50 or 100 years ago, if someone didn't have a pulse, that's it, he was dead, halachically speaking. There was no way to reverse that. Today, we have defibrillators and we have Hatzalah comes, with all these fancy machines. They can do open heart surgery in your living room, right? Hatzalah, I'm sure if you're familiar with that organization. So times of technology, of course, has changed. But like we said before, the criteria of death means cessation, irreversible, and there's a key word, and we'll talk about that, irreversible cessation of brain function or irreversible cessation of heart function. So today where we have technology, new technology that can now change that, so the halacha didn't change. It was always irreversible cessation. We have new technology which now allows us it's no longer irreversible. We have defibrillators and things that can now make it reversible. So until it's irreversible, you're not dead, halachically speaking.
Gotcha.
I want to make it clear again, so I'm just going to restate what I said, which is that if you can save a life by donating a organ from a deceased body, it's 100% permitted to do that. We'll give you certain criteria when we sum it up, the exact criteria needed, but it's 100% permitted because you're saving a life. Saving life overrides anything, as we said. The only issue is, and the reason why people are nervous about it, and there's an issue of controversy, is because there is a controversy as to the time of death in halach. There's different opinions. Again, many opinions say that it's cessation of breathing, and therefore you can donate a body after someone's quote unquote brain death. I realized I didn't address. You said something about partial brain cessation. So Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So some say it just has to do with the breathing, as the Gemara says. It's just an issue of breathing. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was one of the foremost halachic authorities in Israel. Died around 20 years ago. He was of the opinion he wasn't sure how to define the criteria of death, and therefore, and at his conclusion, he says we're not sure, and therefore there has to be total cessation of brain, meaning in the sense of when you have total cessation of brain function, it's as if the person is decapitated. So it has to be complete cessation, which is they use something called the Harvard criteria, which I believe was put forth by Harvard in 1968, if I remember, which is that they have to check. It's not just brain stem death, and it has to be the frontal lobe, everything. There can't be any brain activity whatsoever in the brain, in any part of the brain, to be considered halachically dead. And this is what's used today, according to those opinions who say that's sufficient. By the way, the Rabbinate of Israel, Chief Rabbinate of Israel, does go with that opinion, that brain dead is considered dead. And I want to make this clear, most of the Haredi world today holds the more stringent opinion, which would mean cessation of heart function. Okay, so that's where that's where the controversy is. So it's based on really one main opinion, which is Rabbi Shalom Yosef Elyashiv, who also died around 10, 15 years ago, another great authority in Israel, who he ruled, he felt brain death was not, a cessation of brain death was not halachically dead, and therefore most of the opinions today go with him, the normative opinions to go with him. So that's why it's not so simple, and I'll say this very clearly, being a card-carrying donor is because if you just put on the back of your license, you check off you want to donate your organ, so what happens is they're obviously not going to use the halachic criteria, and they're just going to say, oh, whoop-de-doo, we got an organ, there's a major shortage of organs, and The medical community always will go off brain death today. The last 10 years for sure.
Okay.
Now, what's amazing, one of the things, if you want to go to this, again, I'm not plugging them, there is some controversy with the organization, HODES, but if you go to their website, they allow you to carry a card, which you check off on the back of the card. You check off which opinions. On the back of the card, the front of the card says you're a member of the Halachic Organ Donor Society. On the back of the card, it says you can check off. It says, first of all, I agree to donate my organs for life-saving transplantation, not for research, because, as we're going to see, research is not a permitted reason to take an organ.
You're not saving a life,
right.
But you're
it has
getting
to be specifically for saving a life.
Okay.
So anything done, if you're just putting into a donor bank, something like that, that's not considered saving a life.
Okay.
It has to be specifically, there's a patient waiting for the organ. So in many cases today, you're going to have that. So continuing on what the card says is, so not for research, and only after the option checked. So it gives you a choice of two halachic opinions. The first one is irreversible, unconscious, and irreversible cessation of autonomous breathing, confirmed by whole brain death. And this addresses your question before. It has to be confirmed by whole brain death, including the brain stem, diagnosed by clinical testing, including an apnea test and confirmatory blood flow testing. Okay, and this is the opinion, like we said, of the chief rabbin of Israel and others, but it is somewhat considered a controversial opinion in the Haredi world. The other option says, you can check off on your card, is irreversible cessation of heartbeat. So from a medical perspective, this limits the number of organs that may be recovered because, like we said, it just shortens the window of recovery of the organs. It says the number of all preparations, so this is a key point also, all preparations for transplant must be done in consultation with my family-appointed rabbi. All medical procedures must be done with utmost care, respect, and minimum damage to the cadaver. And then it says you can check off what you wish to donate, and then it says you put down your rabbi's number. It says emergency contact, but really you should put down your rabbi, is your trusted Orthodox rabbi, who you trust, to help them make the proper decisions within the halachic criteria that he deems fit. So that's the key point. So if you're just a card-carrying member of, check it off on the back of your license, or even if you expressed your wishes to your family, and if your family is not religious, or they don't know what your halachic view might have been, or who you consulted with, so that's a problem. But if you have you don't have to use HODES. You can put it in your living will, your medical will, whatever says there, and there are many other Jewish organizations that allow for this, where you put your rabbi's number, who you want consulted in time, and God forbid, when that time is necessary. Right. There are rabbis I've spoken to in the Haredi world who will say, once they offer you both opinions on the card, then, stay away from them. Just make your own, halachic will. But again, that's where the controversy comes in. As we know, Haredi world many times, if this is the normative ruling, which they go with the ruling of Rabbi Yasha, who says heart function, they're usually, so then anyone who presents the other side of the picture, they're not so happy with. The person has to speak to their local Orthodox rabbi, and that's what's important here, and make a decision based on that. Local Orthodox rabbi is not sufficient because you need someone who's proficient specifically with this question, which we're saying is very complex, brain dead or cessation of heart. Most rabbis are not so proficient, honestly, in this area.
So you got to have the right rabbi. Yeah. So you are saying that there's really, the only difference of opinion is whether it's brain sensation or heart, so that organ donation is fine across the board based off which death you're talking about.
Yes, meaning if someone is halachically dead, and that's where the controversy comes in, I don't know of anyone who would disagree in saying you can take that organ to save another person. Now, by the way, this is only, as we're going to see, and we're not talking about corneas, let's say, where it's not life-saving. Someone needs a cornea, someone's blind, and they need a cornea transplant. So now I want to donate my cornea. So that's where it's a whole different issue, because over there, we're saying this applies. The whole override here, as we're saying, is where we have to overcome the challenges is because pikuach nefesh, you're saving a life. So a kidney, a heart, there's no lung in many cases.
Right, liver, anything that...
Something that you're literally saving the person's life, that's where we're saying this is applicable to.
Okay.
Once you get into areas where it's questionable, for example, a cornea, uterus transplant. So the woman's not sick just because she doesn't have a uterus. It just means she can't have children.
Right.
Listen, and not to sound callous about not having children. That's a terrible. It's not a fun thing, and I empathize with people going through that. But they're 100% healthy, quote unquote, halachically speaking. They're not.
But they can't fulfill the mitzvah.
True. Yes. So we might allow them to overcome rabbinic prohibitions, and some do allow that in these cases. Rabbinic prohibitions, because maybe mutilating a body is only rabbinic, maybe burying a body is only. So there are different leniencies for that. But we're here talking about, again, initially we're talking about to save a life, and if someone is 100% halachically dead, depending on these two opinions, depending on your rabbi's opinion, your halachic decisor, whoever you consult with, it's 100% permitted as far as I know. I don't know anyone who would disagree with that. The concern is it has to be done with these criteria, and I'm just going to go through quickly what the criteria are.
Okay.
To wrap it up. There are at least 4 criteria for the donation. One is, I would say, you shouldn't start planning organ donations to be put into a bank. As we said, there has to be what's called a patient who's ready to accept that organ and it's saving their life. Okay. Number 2, the donor must be completely verified as halachically dead. And that's what we mentioned depends on these 2 opinions. Will depend on 2 opinions we spoke about above of cessation of heart function, total cessation of brain function. Number 3, as we just mentioned, the recipient must be in a life-threatening situation. And number 4, it is ideal if the donor agreed during his lifetime to donate his organs after death. Because again, the question becomes, who owns someone's body after death? Which is an interesting question. Right. Now again, is it a mitzvah? You don't really have, after death, you have no mitzvahs anymore. So it can't be your obligation because you're dead.
Right.
Okay, so a dead person has no more obligations. Now it is, of course, it will help. Assuming you're doing a mitzvah, you're saving someone's life. Hopefully, it'll help you wherever you are and give you some brownie points up there. And we're all going to need it when we get up there. So it's in that sense a good thing. But you can't say it's obligatory for the dead person. So who owns the body? Does the family own the body? This is a different dilemma in halacha. Who owns someone's body after death? As you mentioned before, God owns. We're all on loan from God for 80 years. So we really don't own our bodies, and our families don't own our bodies. But of course, it's ideal for if the donor agreed prior to his lifetime to donate the organs. We don't just go ahead and do it anyway against the donor's wishes. Gotcha. In certain cases, you might be allowed to. Again, that would be consult your halachic authority on that. Because, again, we're saving a life, and that overrides anything. So it's not stealing per se, but we don't, we're not going to condone going in and stealing organs from the, from the hospital. So those are basically the 4 criteria, again, to save a life. Now, just to wrap it up, so as far as if it's non-life-saving organ, so that's where you get into other questions, and I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of them, but like a cornea, it's more problematic in those cases because, again, you're not saving a life. So over there, it gets into issues. If it's rabbinical, if the prohibitions, the challenges we mentioned before, which is like we're saying, burying the dead, and then if there are rabbinical challenges, so many will say, so it's okay to violate a rabbinic law, even for cases, let's say, like you mentioned, where someone could allow them to have kids or etc. Some of those things allow them to see cornea. And so that's where there's more controversy. That sums it up. I want to emphasize 2 things. Having a standard donor card is never a good idea. That's important to note. And there is, because there's such a desperation today for harvesting organs, I've heard of stories, again, horror stories, where in the hospitals, even prior to total cessation of death, someone is just in a vegetative state. They're not going to necessarily use the Harvard criteria to ascertain brain death. They're just such in a rush to harvest the organs many times that they'll do it prior to the person halachically dead, even if in the opinion of brain death. And therefore, you have to be very careful where it says it cannot be done without consultation with Rabbi X, who's, again, proficient in the matter, will know what to ask for prior to them removing the organs and to make sure it's done in a halachic manner. So I want to emphasize that again, that it should be clear, whatever living will you're writing or whatever card you're carrying, it needs to state that with the rabbi's number, or your family should at least know that, your next of kin. That's a key part of this, because without that, there are many horror stories of them harvesting organs prior to someone being considered, forget about halachically dead, even clinically dead.
Right.
So that's the key point.
Okay, beautiful. Rabbi, I appreciate your expertise and sharing with us everything we need to know about this matter. Very informative, very helpful. And it sounds like there's some other topics that I can bring you on to talk about now that I can make you a sort of ongoing official guest of the Shema podcast.
It was my honor to be here.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting Torch so they can continue to spread Torah wisdom to the world by making a donation at torchweb.org and clicking donate in the top right corner of the page. And if you would like to get in contact with our host with comments, suggestions for future topics of learning, or questions for him or his guest rabbis, you may email him at president@torchweb.org.